a plague linked to the collapse of Neolithic population 5,200 years ago. The new findings suggest that the plague may have once decimated Neolithic farmers across northern Europe. Stephen Shannon, around 5,200 years ago, he says, plague was not most present but common in 6 generations of one Swedish family, according to a new study. The researchers analyzed both the ancient DNA of these people's skeletons remains and the pathogens that left traces in them. And what we're looking at here is actually tombs. These were grave sites, and they look very much like, actually, the grave site, the tomb of the fallen soldiers of the Athenians, the tomb of Marathon, where the marathon run starts, looks just like this. Okay, they would bury them, then they would cover them with soil, and grass would grow over them. These are the ancient tombs that they had at that time. The Battle of Marathon was about 500 BC. That was about 2,500 years ago. So these are 5,200 years ago, just as a matter of reference. These were massed grave sites, mass tombs were like this. So 3 different strains of plague were present, of which the latest was possibly significantly more virulent than the earlier 2. However, none had the gene that enabled the flea-based transmission behind the spread of the bubonic plague, the Black Death disease that resulted in the loss of half the population of some parts of medieval Europe between 1347 and 1351. The authors of the new study analyzed ancient DNA from 108 Scandinavian Neolithic people found in 8 megalithic large stone tombs in Sweden and 1 stone cyst, a coffin-like box in the ground in Denmark. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, was found in about 17% of those DNA whose DNA was sequenced, but this probably underestimates its frequency. The 3 distinct waves of plague spread through the population over a period of around 120 years. The first 2 waves were small and contained, but the third was more widespread. Population crashes. The researchers suggest the wide prevalence of plague around 5,200 years ago could have contributed to the striking decline seen in the Neolithic population in Europe. These declines, of the order of those seen during the Black Death, have been revealed by archaeological research in southern Scandinavia and many other parts of Europe over the last 15 years. We know this in part because the number of radiocarbon dated archaeological sites drops very considerably in this period. Analysis of fossil pollen from plants and trees preserved in bogs and lakes also suggest areas that had previously been cleared for farming saw the regrowth of forests. So these 2 lines of evidence support one another. But while the population declines are not in doubt, the idea that plague was responsible is much more open to question. To understand why, we need to go a bit further back. Farming was brought into southern Scandinavia around 6,000 years ago by immigrant descendants of people originally from present-day Turkey. These farmers had intermixed to varying degrees. Present-day Turkey was actually ancient Greece. Okay, so we know that ancient Greeks had trade all along the Mediterranean, even into the British Isles and into Scandinavia, and most of these were Spartans and of the tribe of Dan. Okay, now these farmers had intermixed to varying degrees with local hunter-gatherers, the people already present in Europe, as they dispersed across the continent over the preceding 2,500 years. The population of farmers in southern Scandinavia expanded very rapidly, reaching a peak around 5,600 years ago, 400 years after their arrival. At this point, it started to decrease, dropping by perhaps as much as 60 to 70% over the following 300 years. The decline was not a sudden event like the Black Death, but a gradual process. In fact, by the time of the occurrence of plague revealed by the new research, the population level had already reached its floor, but the population continued to remain low, so plague might have been instrumental in this. Britain makes an interesting comparison. Here too, farming was introduced by immigrants around 6,000 years ago, and we see exactly the same pattern. The population rises to a peak 400 years later, then gradually declines until it reached a low point 500 to 600 years later. After the first couple of hundred years of farming immigration, there is very little evidence of continental connections that could have introduced plague until the arrival of new immigrants from at least 4,500 years ago. From the east, 4,500 years ago. These immigrants carried a type of genetic ancestry known as Eurasian steppe ancestry that had first appeared in the western half of Europe around 5,000 years ago. It seems significant that, so far, the earliest evidence of plague in Britain is after this, from 2 Bronze Age sites dating to around 4,000 years ago. It's also worth noting that farming was very late arriving in the northwest extremities of Europe. Immigrant farmers had arrived in southeast and central Europe 8,500 to 7,500 years ago, respectively. And here too, wherever people have looked, they have found similar boom-bust population patterns. In other words, there seems to be some general process going on here that we still don't really understand. Possible explanations include outbreaks of violence as the population peaks and climate cooling events affecting crop yields. For the moment, disease outbreaks look a less likely explanation. This is from Stephen Shannon, Professor of Theoretical Archaeology, UCL, from the conversation here under Creative Commons on Unexplained Mysteries. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.